"You'll sleep in the garage tonight, Rachel. The guest room is for actual family." Those words hit me like ice water as I stood in my own kitchen, holding the suitcase I'd packed for what I thought would be a lovely extended visit with my son Richard and his new wife Jessica. I was 68 years old, recovering from hip replacement surgery, and I'd just driven 4 hours to help them settle into their new home. Jessica's voice dripped with sugary venom as she continued, "Don't look so shocked. You're not staying in my house like some freeloader." What Jessica didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I wasn't just visiting their house. I owned it. Every brick, every beam, every square inch of the property they thought belonged to them. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how a woman who spent 45 years putting family first finally learned to put herself first, and how the most humiliating night of my life became the catalyst for the most satisfying revenge I've ever witnessed. The whole thing started 6 months earlier when Richard called me, practically vibrating with excitement through the phone. "Mom, Jessica and I found the perfect house. It's everything we've dreamed of: 4 bedrooms, a 2-car garage, huge backyard for the kids we're planning. The only problem is we're about 20,000 short for the down payment." He paused, and I could hear that familiar tone creeping in, the one he'd used since childhood when he wanted something. "I was wondering if you might consider helping us out. You know, as an investment." I should have seen the red flags then. Richard had always been my golden boy, my only child after 3 miscarriages that nearly broke my heart. When his father died in a car accident 15 years ago, it had been just Richard and me against the world. I'd worked double shifts as a nurse to put him through college, sold my mother's jewelry to help with his wedding to his first wife, and when that marriage ended in a bitter divorce, I'd been the one to help him rebuild his life. So when he asked for help with this house, of course I said yes. But instead of just lending them the money, I made what I thought was a smart decision. I told Richard I'd buy the house outright and let them live in it, with the understanding that they'd gradually buy it from me over time. "Think of it as rent to own," I explained. "You'll have stability, and I'll have the security of knowing my investment is protected." Richard was thrilled, Jessica seemed pleased enough, and I felt good about helping my son achieve his dream of homeownership. The paperwork was all in my name, Rachel Eleanor Thompson. I paid the full purchase price of $385,000, depleting a significant portion of my retirement savings, but feeling good about securing my son's future. Richard and Jessica moved in immediately, and for the first few months, everything seemed perfect. They sent me photos of their decorating progress, invited me for Sunday dinners, and Jessica even called me Mom a few times, which made my heart sing. But slowly, things began to change. The monthly payments they were supposed to make became irregular, then stopped altogether. When I brought it up gently during phone calls, Richard would say they were going through a rough patch or just need a few more weeks. Jessica would get on the phone and speak in that breathy, syrupy tone that I was starting to recognize as her manipulation voice. "Oh, Rachel, you know we're good for it. Family helps family, right? Besides, it's not like you need the money immediately." The first time she called me by my first name instead of Mom, I felt a little prick of unease. The second time she referred to our house in front of neighbors, I noticed but said nothing. By the time she was posting on social media about our beautiful home and talking about our mortgage payments to anyone who would listen, I was beginning to understand that Jessica had rewritten the narrative in her mind. Somehow, in her version of events, they owned the house, and I was just some elderly woman who'd help them out with a loan they'd pay back when convenient. I probably would have continued letting it slide. After all, family harmony was important to me, and I didn't want to create conflict. But then Jessica got pregnant and everything changed. The phone call came on a Tuesday evening in November. Jessica's voice was different, harder, more direct. "Rachel, we need to talk about the house situation." She didn't even bother with pleasantries. "Now that we're starting our family, we need to establish some boundaries. This is our home, and we can't have you just showing up whenever you feel like it." I was confused. "Showing up?" "Jessica, I've only visited twice since you moved in, and both times you invited me." "Well, things are different now. I'm pregnant, and stress isn't good for the baby. Richard and I have decided that any visits need to be approved in advance, and they can't be longer than a weekend. We're building our own family traditions now." The words stung, but I tried to be understanding. Pregnancy hormones could make women feel territorial, and I remembered how protective I'd felt when I was carrying Richard. "Of course, sweetheart. I don't want to impose. I just want to be helpful when the baby comes." About that, Jessica's voice took on that syrupy quality again. We've decided we wanted to handle the first few months on our own. You know, bond as a nuclear family. Maybe you can visit when the baby's older." I hung up feeling dismissed and confused, but I told myself it would pass. First-time mothers often felt overwhelmed, and Jessica would probably appreciate my help once the reality of caring for a newborn set in. I decided to give them space and wait for them to reach out. They didn't. For months, I got updates through Richard's brief, guilty-sounding phone calls. The baby, a little girl they named Emma, was born in May. I wasn't invited to the hospital. I wasn't invited to the baby shower Jessica's friends threw at their house. I wasn't invited to Emma's baptism at the church 3 blocks from the house I owned. Instead, I got text message photos and awkward video calls where Jessica would hold the baby just out of frame, talking about how overwhelming everything was and how they were still adjusting to parenthood. When I asked about visiting, she'd sigh dramatically and say things like, "Maybe in a few weeks when things settle down," or "The pediatrician says we should limit visitors until Emma's immune system strengthens." 6 months passed. 6 months of watching my son's life through carefully curated social media posts and stilted phone conversations. 6 months of seeing my granddaughter grow up in pixels and pixels alone. 6 months of watching Jessica redecorate my house and post about Emma's nursery in our beautiful home and Sunday dinners in our dream kitchen. The breaking point came when I saw Jessica's Instagram post about Emma's first Christmas. There was my granddaughter sitting under a Christmas tree in my living room, surrounded by presents and family, Jessica's family. Her parents, her sister, her grandmother, all gathered in my house for a Christmas celebration I wasn't invited to. The caption read, "Emma's first Christmas in our home." So grateful for all the family who made this day special. I stared at that photo until my eyes burned. There was Emma, 6 months old, wearing a red velvet dress and sitting on a blanket I didn't recognize, in front of a fireplace I'd helped pick out when I bought the house. Jessica's mother was holding her, and everyone was smiling like they belonged there, like they were the real family, like I was just some distant relative who might send a card if they were lucky. That's when I made the decision to visit whether they approved or not. I didn't call ahead. I didn't ask permission. I drove the 4 hours from my apartment in Millfield to the house in Riverside on a cold February morning, my hip still aching from the surgery I'd had 3 weeks earlier. The doctor had told me to take it easy, to avoid driving long distances, but I needed to see my granddaughter. I needed to remind myself that I still mattered to my son. I parked in the driveway, my driveway, and walked carefully up the front steps, using the railing for support. My hip was throbbing, but I was determined. I rang the doorbell and waited, listening to the sounds of life inside the house. Emma crying, Richard's voice trying to soothe her, Jessica calling out something I couldn't quite hear. When the door opened, Jessica's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, annoyance, and then that fake smile she'd perfected. "Rachel! What a surprise! We weren't expecting you." "I know," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I should have called, but I was in the area and thought I'd stop by to see Emma. It's been so long." Jessica didn't move from the doorway. "Oh, well, this really isn't a good time. Emma's been fussy all morning, and Richard's trying to get her down for a nap. Maybe you could come back another time." Behind her, I could hear my son's voice. "Who's at the door?" "It's your mother," Jessica called back, and I caught the edge of irritation in her tone. Richard appeared, holding Emma, and my heart clenched. My granddaughter had grown so much since the last video call. She had Richard's dark hair and what looked like my late husband's blue eyes. She was beautiful, and she was a stranger to me. "Mom, what are you doing here?" Richard looked genuinely surprised, but not necessarily pleased. "I came to see you and meet Emma properly, I said, reaching toward my granddaughter. "May I hold her?" Emma started crying harder at the sight of me, and Jessica immediately took her from Richard. "She doesn't like strangers," Jessica said, bouncing Emma with practiced ease. "It takes her a while to warm up to new people." New people. The words hit me like a slap. I was new people to my own granddaughter. "Mom," Richard said, looking uncomfortable, "you really should have called first. We could have prepared Emma, maybe had you visit when she was in a better mood." "I understand," I said, though I didn't understand at all. "Could I at least come in for a few minutes? I drove 4 hours and my hip is still healing from surgery." Jessica and Richard exchanged a look, one of those married couple communications that happens in seconds. Then Jessica stepped back reluctantly. I suppose you can come in for a little while. The house looked different. They'd rearranged the furniture, painted the walls, and added their own decorative touches. It was still my house, but it felt foreign. Family photos covered the mantelpiece, photos of Richard, Jessica, and Emma, along with pictures of Jessica's extended family. There wasn't a single photo of me. I settled carefully into the armchair I remembered helping them pick out, trying to ease the pressure on my hip. "The house looks lovely, I said. "You've really made it your own." "Thanks," Jessica said, still holding Emma, who had finally stopped crying. "We've put a lot of work into making it perfect for our family." We made stilted conversation for about 20 minutes. I asked about Emma's development, Richard's work, Jessica's plans to return to her job. They answered politely but distantly, like I was a neighbor making a social call rather than the grandmother who'd enabled their entire lifestyle. When Emma finally fell asleep in Jessica's arms, I asked softly, "Could I hold her now?" "Just for a moment." Jessica hesitated. "She's finally settled. I don't want to risk waking her up." "I'll be very careful," she was phoned, I promised. "I just want to hold my granddaughter for a few minutes." Another look passed between Richard and Jessica. Then Richard nodded slightly, and Jessica very carefully transferred Emma to my arms. The moment Emma was in my arms, everything else faded away. She was warm and perfect, with tiny fingers that curled reflexively around mine. She had that sweet baby smell that I remembered from when Richard was small. For those few precious minutes, holding Emma felt like coming home. But then Emma stirred and started to fuss, and Jessica immediately reached for her. "I need to feed her," she said, taking Emma back. "She's very particular about her routine." I watched Jessica carry my granddaughter upstairs, and suddenly I felt like an intruder in my own house. Richard sat across from me, looking at his phone and making small talk about work, but I could tell he was waiting for me to leave. "I was hoping I could stay for dinner," I said finally. "Maybe spend the night so I could have more time with Emma?" Richard looked genuinely surprised. "Stay the night?" "Mom, we don't really have space set up for guests right now. Emma's stuff is everywhere, and Jessica's been having trouble sleeping." "I could sleep on the couch," I offered. "I just want to spend a little more time with my granddaughter." "I don't think that's a good idea," Richard said carefully. "Maybe next time you could plan a longer visit, and we could prepare better." I felt the familiar sting of rejection, but I tried one more time. "What about this weekend?" "I could come Friday evening and leave Sunday morning. I promise not to interfere with Emma's routine." Richard looked uncomfortable. "This weekend isn't good. Jessica's mother is coming to help with Emma, and the house will be pretty full." Jessica's mother. Jessica's mother was welcome to stay and help with Emma, but Emma's other grandmother, the grandmother who owned the house they were living in, was not. I left that afternoon feeling more alone than I had since my husband died. The 4-hour drive home passed in a blur of tears and growing resentment. By the time I reached my small apartment, I had made a decision. I was going to find out exactly what was happening in my house and why I was being systematically excluded from my son's life. Over the next few weeks, I did something I'd never done before. I investigated my own family. I started following Jessica's social media more closely, paying attention to the details in her posts. I noticed that Jessica's mother seemed to be visiting every weekend. I saw photos of Jessica's sister helping with Emma, of Jessica's friends coming over for girls' nights in my living room, of Jessica's father helping Richard with yard work. But what really opened my eyes was a post Jessica made about our mortgage payment adventure. She'd written a long caption about the challenges of homeownership, talking about property taxes and homeowners insurance and the pride of building equity in our dream home. She was presenting herself as a homeowner on social media, collecting sympathy and advice from friends who had no idea she was living in someone else's house, rent-free. I started making phone calls. I called the county assessor's office to confirm that the house was still in my name. It was. I called my insurance company to make sure the homeowner's policy was current. It was, and I was still paying the premiums. I called the mortgage company to confirm that the house was paid in full. It was, with my money. On paper, I owned every inch of that property. But somehow, Jessica had convinced herself and everyone around her that she was the rightful owner, and my son was going along with it. The final piece of the puzzle came when I decided to drive by the house one Saturday afternoon. I didn't plan to stop. I just wanted to see if Jessica's mother's car was there again. But what I saw made me park across the street and watch. Jessica's entire extended family was there. Cars filled the driveway and lined the street. Through the windows, I could see a crowd of people in my living room. Children were running around my backyard. Someone had set up a grill on my patio. I sat in my car for an hour, watching my house host a family gathering I wasn't invited to. I watched Jessica's father manning the grill I'd bought. I watched Jessica's mother carrying Emma around the yard I'd helped landscape. I watched my son playing cornhole with Jessica's brothers-in-law on the lawn I was still paying to maintain. It was then that I understood the full scope of what was happening. This wasn't just about Jessica being territorial or protective. This was about replacement. Jessica was systematically replacing me with her own family, using my house as the foundation for creating a new family identity that didn't include me, and my son was letting it happen. I drove home that day with a rage that burned cold and steady in my chest. For 45 years, I had put my family first. I had sacrificed my own comfort, my own dreams, my own financial security to make sure Richard had everything he needed. I had worked extra shifts to pay for his college. I had co-signed loans when his credit was bad. I had babysat his friends' children when he wanted to impress girlfriends. I had hosted every holiday, cooked every special meal, and been the family photographer for every milestone. And now I was being erased. That night, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible to me even a week earlier. I was going to take my house back. Not just legally. I'd always owned it legally. I was going to take it back emotionally, socially, and practically. If Jessica wanted to play house with my property, she was going to learn that the real owner wasn't as powerless as she assumed. But I wasn't going to be rash about it. I was going to be smart. The first call I made was to Patricia Kellerman, the real estate attorney who'd handled the original purchase. Patricia and I had worked together years earlier when I'd bought my first investment property, and she'd always been straight with me about the legal realities of real estate ownership. "Rachel," Patricia said after I'd explained the situation, "you're in a very strong legal position, but there are some practical considerations we need to discuss. Since Richard and Jessica have been living in the house for over a year, they might have some tenant rights even without a formal lease agreement. If you want them out, we need to follow proper legal procedures." "What kind of procedures?" I asked. "Well, first you'd need to serve them with proper notice. Probably a 30-day notice to vacate since they're not paying rent. If they refuse to leave after that, you'd have to file for eviction. It's not complicated, but it takes time and follows specific legal steps." "How long would the whole process take?" "If they cooperate and leave after the 30-day notice, you could have your house back in a month. If they fight it, it could take several months and get expensive. Plus, there's the family dynamic to consider. Are you prepared for the relationship consequences?" I thought about Emma's face when she'd cried at the sight of me, about Jessica's mother holding my granddaughter in my living room, about Richard's uncomfortable expression when I'd asked to stay for dinner. "Patricia," I said, "I think the relationship has already been damaged beyond repair. I'm not doing this to hurt them. I'm doing this to save what's left of my dignity. In that case," Patricia said, "let's talk about the proper way to handle this." Over the next week, Patricia and I worked out a strategy. She would prepare a formal 30-day notice to vacate, citing my rights as the property owner. The notice would be professional, legal, and firm. It would give Richard and Jessica a month to find other housing arrangements, and it would make clear that their tenancy, such as it was ending. But before I served the notice, I decided to make one last attempt at reconciliation. I wasn't ready to completely blow up my relationship with my son without giving him a chance to understand how his actions had affected me. I called Richard on a Tuesday evening when I knew Emma would be asleep and he might be more inclined to have a real conversation. "Mom, hi," he said, and I could hear the television in the background. "How are you feeling?" "How's your hip?" "My hip is healing fine," like I said. "Richard, I need to talk to you about something important. Do you have a few minutes?" "Sure, what's up?" I took a deep breath. "I've been thinking a lot about my visit last month, and I'm concerned about how things are between us. I feel like I'm being excluded from your life, and I don't understand why." There was a pause. "Mom, you're not being excluded. We've just been busy with the baby, and Jessica's still adjusting to motherhood. It's not personal." "It feels personal," I said gently. "I saw Jessica's social media posts about Emma's first Christmas. Your entire extended family was there. Jessica's family, I mean, but I wasn't invited." Another pause, longer this time. "That was complicated. Jessica's family had already made plans, and the house was pretty full. Richard, it's my house." The words hung in the air between us. I hadn't meant to say it so bluntly, but there it was. I know you helped us with the down payment, Mom, and we're grateful. No, I interrupted. Richard, I didn't help with the down payment. I bought the house. The deed is in my name. I own it outright. Well, yeah, technically, but we had an agreement. What agreement? My voice was sharper than I'd intended. Richard, you've been living in my house for over a year without paying me a dime. You've been presenting yourselves as homeowners to your friends and family, and now I'm being treated like an unwelcome guest in my own property. Mom, that's not... we've had some financial challenges, but we always plan to pay you back. When? You haven't made a payment in 8 months. You haven't even talked about payments in 8 months. When Jessica posts about our mortgage and our dream home, what exactly does she think she's paying for? Richard was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was defensive. Look, Mom, Jessica's been under a lot of stress with the baby. Maybe she's not handling everything perfectly, but she's doing her best, and we've put a lot of work into the house. Work that increased the value of my investment, I said. Richard, I need you to understand something. I love you, and I love Emma, but I can't continue this arrangement. If you want to own the house, we need to formalize a purchase agreement with a timeline and payment schedule. If you can't afford to buy it, then you need to treat me with the respect that a landlord deserves. But I won't continue being treated like an outsider while you and Jessica play house with my property. Mom, you're being dramatic. Am I? The rage I'd been holding back finally found its voice. Richard, when's the last time I was invited to Sunday dinner? When's the last time Jessica called me Mom? When's the last time you asked for my advice about anything? I'm your mother, and I'm Emma's grandmother, but I've been relegated to the role of inconvenient relative who occasionally gets a phone call. That's not true. Then prove it. Invite me for Emma's first birthday. Give me a schedule for when you're going to start paying me back. Treat me like family instead of like some distant aunt who might show up unexpectedly. Richard was quiet for almost a minute. When he finally spoke, his voice was strained. I need to talk to Jessica about this. Can I call you back tomorrow? Of course, I said. But, Richard, I need you to understand that things can't continue the way they've been. I'm 68 years old, I'm recovering from surgery, and I'm being excluded from my son's life while living off my generosity. Something has to change. He never called me back. 2 days later, I got a text message from Jessica. Richard told me about your conversation. We think it's best if we all take some space for a while. We'll be in touch when we're ready to discuss things calmly. Space. They wanted space. In my house. That's when I called Patricia and told her to prepare the eviction notice. But before I served the papers, I decided to take one more drive to see my house. I wanted to look at it one last time before I potentially destroyed my relationship with my son forever. It was a Thursday afternoon in early March, and I thought the house would be quiet. Instead, I found cars in the driveway again. Not Jessica's family this time. These were cars I didn't recognize. I parked across the street and watched as people carried boxes and furniture out of the house and loaded them into a moving truck. They were moving, without telling me. After our conversation about my ownership and their financial obligations, after Jessica's text about taking space, they were simply moving out of my house without a word. I sat in my car and watched strangers pack up the belongings my son and daughter-in-law had accumulated during their rent-free year in my house. I watched them load Emma's crib, the dining room set I'd helped them pick out, the couch where I'd held my granddaughter for those few precious minutes. Part of me felt relief. If they were moving out voluntarily, I wouldn't have to go through the eviction process. I wouldn't have to serve papers or go to court or explain to a judge why I was trying to evict my own son. But a larger part of me felt a grief so profound it took my breath away. They were moving and they hadn't told me. My son was leaving my house, possibly leaving my life, and I was finding out by accident, sitting in my car like a stalker, watching strangers pack up his belongings. I called Richard as I sat there watching the movers work. Mom, he said, and his voice was guarded. I'm sitting outside the house, I said. There's a moving truck in the driveway. A long pause. Yeah. We found a place. We're moving this weekend. Where? Jessica found a rental house on the other side of town. It's smaller, but it's ours. Ours. The word stung. My house had never been theirs, even though they'd lived in it for a year. Were you planning to tell me? I asked. Of course. I was going to call you once we got settled. Richard, I own the house you're moving out of. Don't you think I deserve to know your plans? You made it pretty clear that you wanted us out, he said, and there was an edge to his voice I'd never heard before. I wanted us to have an honest relationship, I said. I wanted to be treated like family instead of like an inconvenience. Well, now you'll have your house back, and we'll have our independence. Maybe this is better for everyone. The movers were carrying out Emma's high chair, the one I'd bought for her when Jessica had mentioned needing one. They'd probably forgotten it was a gift from me. Will I still be able to see Emma? I asked, and my voice was smaller than I'd intended. Of course, Richard said, but he didn't sound convinced. We just need some time to get settled and figure things out. Figure what out? Everything, Mom. This whole situation has been complicated. Richard, I said, watching a mover carry out a box labeled Emma's Toys. I love you. I love Emma. I never wanted this to become a fight. I know, he said, and for a moment he sounded like my little boy again. I love you too, but Jessica feels like you've been judging her, and it's been hard on our marriage. I've never judged Jessica. You want more access to Emma than she's comfortable giving. You question our decisions. You make her feel like she's not doing things right. I asked to see my granddaughter. How is that questioning your decisions? It's not just that, Mom. It's the way you ask. It's the expectations. Jessica feels like she can never live up to what you want from her. I watched the movers for another moment, processing what Richard was telling me. Somehow, my desire to be part of my granddaughter's life had been reframed as unreasonable expectations. My questions about their plans had become judgment. My hurt at being excluded had become pressure. What can I do? I asked finally. How can I fix this? Give us time, Sir Fabichard said. Let us settle into our new place and figure out our routine with Emma. Then we can talk about visits and establishing boundaries that work for everyone. How much time? I don't know. A few months, maybe? A few months? Emma would be walking by then. She'd be saying her first words. She'd be developing a personality and preferences and little quirks that I'd only hear about secondhand, if at all. Okay, I said, because what else could I say? I'll wait to hear from you. Thanks, Mom. I think this is the right thing for everyone. I hung up and sat in my car until the moving truck pulled away. Then I drove home to my apartment and cried for 3 hours straight. The next week, I drove back to the house to assess what needed to be done before I could consider renting it out or selling it. I expected to find it empty and probably needing a thorough cleaning. Instead, I found a disaster. The walls had holes where they'd removed wall-mounted televisions without regard for the drywall. The hardwood floors were scratched from furniture being dragged across them. The kitchen had stains on the countertops and a broken cabinet door. The master bathroom had a cracked tile where something heavy had been dropped. But the worst part was what they'd left behind. The house wasn't empty, it was full of junk. Broken furniture they hadn't bothered to take. Paint cans and brushes left open to dry out. Bags of garbage in the basement. Old clothes scattered in the closets. Emma's broken toys and outgrown clothes piled in what had been her nursery. They'd treated my house like a storage unit for things they didn't want to deal with, and they'd left it for me to clean up. I walked through the rooms I'd furnished with such care, surveying the damage and calculating the cost of repairs. The security deposit I'd never collected wouldn't have covered half of what needed to be fixed. The rent they'd never paid wouldn't have covered the other half. But more than the money, more than the property damage, I was furious about the disrespect. This was how they thought of me, as someone whose property didn't matter, whose generosity could be taken for granted, whose feelings were irrelevant as long as they got what they wanted. I took photos of every room, every damaged surface, every pile of abandoned belongings. Then I called Patricia. They've moved out, I told her. But they've left the house in terrible condition and full of their unwanted possessions. That's unfortunately common in these situations, Patricia said. You have a few options. You can clean it up yourself and absorb the cost. You can send them a bill for damages and hope they pay it, or you can take them to small claims court for the cost of repairs and cleanup. What would you recommend? Personally, I'd document everything, get repair estimates, and send them a detailed bill. If they don't pay it, you can decide whether it's worth pursuing legally. But Rachel, You should know that taking your own son to court over property damage could permanently damage your relationship. I think my relationship with my son is already permanently damaged, I said. At this point, I'm more interested in recovering my costs and my dignity. It took me 2 weeks to clean out the house and get repair estimates. The total damage came to just over $8,000. New flooring in 2 rooms, wall repairs, professional carpet cleaning, appliance repairs, and a dumpster rental for all the junk they'd left behind. I sent Richard and Jessica an itemized bill with photos and a request that they cover the costs within 30 days. Jessica's response came via text message. We think $8,000 is ridiculous for normal wear and tear. We took good care of the house and left it in reasonable condition. If you want to renovate, that's your choice, but it's not our responsibility. Normal wear and tear. Broken tiles and holes in walls were normal wear and tear. That's when I decided to take a different approach. I started posting on social media myself. I'd never been much of a Facebook user. I had an account mostly to see photos of Emma and keep up with old nursing colleagues. But now I created a detailed post about my experience, complete with before and after photos of my house. I'm sharing this story because I think other grandparents might relate, I wrote. A year ago, I bought a house for my son and daughter-in-law to live in while they saved money to eventually purchase it from me. I paid $385,000 in cash and allowed them to live there rent-free while they got on their feet. Over the past year, I was gradually excluded from family gatherings, and my granddaughter's life told I was too demanding and needed to respect boundaries. Last week, they moved out without notice, leaving my house damaged and full of their unwanted belongings. When I asked them to cover the repair costs, they told me I was being unreasonable. I'm sharing this not for sympathy, but because I want other grandparents to understand their rights and worth. We are not ATMS for our adult children, and we deserve to be treated with respect. I included photos of the damaged walls, the broken bathroom tile, and the piles of abandoned possessions. I tagged Richard in the post. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within an hour, the post had dozens of comments from friends expressing shock and support. By the end of the day, it had been shared over 100 times by people who said they'd experienced similar situations with their own adult children. But the comment that mattered most came from someone I didn't expect. Jessica's mother. Rachel, I had no idea about any of this. Jessica told us you'd given them the house as a gift, and that you were being possessive about your role as grandmother. If what you're saying is true, I'm horrified by my daughter's behavior. Please call me. An hour later, my phone rang. Mrs. Thompson? This is Carol Brennan, Jessica's mother. I just saw your Facebook post. Hello, Carol. I remember meeting you at Richard and Jessica's wedding. Mrs. Thompson, I need you to know that Jessica told us a completely different story about the house situation. She said you'd given them the house as a wedding gift and that you were trying to control their parenting decisions. We had no idea you were paying for everything while being excluded from Emma's life. I felt a mix of vindication and sadness. What exactly did Jessica tell you? She said you'd bought the house but put it in their name and that you were using it as leverage to insert yourself into their marriage and Emma's care. She said you were showing up unannounced and criticizing her parenting. I felt my stomach clench. Carol, the house is still in my name. I own it completely. They never made a single payment toward purchasing it from me. And I visited exactly twice in over a year, both times when invited. There was a long silence on the other end of the phone. Are you telling me that Jessica has been lying to us about owning the house? I'm telling you that I have the deed. I pay the insurance and taxes, and they've been living there rent-free for over a year while presenting themselves as homeowners. Oh my God. Carol's voice was barely a whisper. Mrs. Thompson, I am so sorry. We've been enabling this behavior without knowing the truth. Jessica's father actually helped them with what we thought were mortgage payments last month. Mortgage payments for a house that's already paid off, I said quietly. This is fraud, isn't it? She's been taking money from us under false pretenses. I don't know what the legal definition would be, I said, but it's certainly dishonest. Carol was quiet for another moment. Mrs. Thompson, would you be willing to meet with me? I think there are some things you should know about how Jessica has been presenting this situation to our family. We met 2 days later at a coffee shop halfway between our towns. Carol looked tired and embarrassed, clutching a folder full of papers. Before we start, she said, I want you to know that Jessica's father and I had no idea about the true ownership of the house. If we had known, we never would have supported her behavior toward you." She opened the folder and showed me printouts of text messages between her and Jessica. "These are some of the conversations we've had about you over the past year. I'm showing you this because I think you deserve to know how deeply the deception goes." I read through the messages with growing disbelief. In Jessica's version of events, I was a controlling, manipulative woman who used my financial contribution to the house as a weapon. According to the texts, I had demanded keys to their house, insisted on having my own bedroom for whenever I wanted to visit, and criticized Jessica's mothering constantly. "None of this is true," I said, looking up at Carol. "I'm beginning to understand that," Carol said. "But there's more." She pulled out another set of printouts. "These are posts from a private Facebook group Jessica belongs to, a support group for new mothers. She's been telling them that her narcissistic mother-in-law has been harassing her and trying to steal her baby." I read through posts where Jessica described me as showing up at the hospital uninvited after Emma's birth, demanding overnight visits every weekend, and making comments about her inadequate parenting. In one particularly hurtful post, she'd written, "My MIL acts like she's Emma's real mother, and I'm just the babysitter. She keeps threatening to take back her house if I don't let her have unlimited access to my daughter." "Carol," I said, my voice shaking, "I wasn't even told when Emma was born. I found out 3 days later through a text message. I've seen Emma exactly once since she was born, and that was when I showed up unannounced after months of being ignored." Carol reached across the table and touched my hand. "Rachel, I believe you, and I'm horrified that my daughter has been capable of this level of deception. What I don't understand, I said, is why. Why create such elaborate lies? Why work so hard to exclude me while making me look like the villain?" Carol sighed deeply. "I think I know." Jessica has always had issues with sharing attention. When she was younger, she struggled when her sister got praise or recognition. She needs to be the center of her own universe, and she saw you as competition for Richard's attention and Emma's affection. But I never tried to compete with her. I just wanted to be part of Emma's life. I know, but in Jessica's mind, any relationship Emma had with you was a threat to her own importance. She needed to be the only important woman in that house, the only grandmother figure Emma needed. What about Richard? How has he been going along with this? Carol looked uncomfortable. From what I can tell, Jessica has been very strategic about how she presents things to Richard. She doesn't lie outright. She frames situations in ways that make her look reasonable and you look demanding. And Richard wants peace in his marriage, so he goes along with what Jessica wants. We talked for another hour. Carol shared more examples of Jessica's manipulation, and I told her about the condition they'd left the house in and their refusal to pay for damages. By the end of our conversation, Carol was in tears. "Rachel, I don't know how to fix this," she said, "but I want you to know that Jessica's father and I will not be supporting their behavior anymore, and we want to have a relationship with you if you're willing." "What about Emma?" I asked. "Will I ever get to know my granddaughter?" "I don't know," Carol said honestly. "Jessica has a lot of control over Richard right now, and she's very good at playing the victim. But maybe if enough people stop enabling her behavior, she'll be forced to change." That conversation with Carol changed everything for me. For months, I'd been questioning myself, wondering if I really had been too demanding or controlling. But hearing about Jessica's lies from someone else helped me understand that this wasn't about my behavior at all. This was about Jessica's need to control the narrative and eliminate any threats to her position as the central figure in her family. I went home that night and made a decision. I was done trying to fix things with Jessica. I was done waiting for Richard to stand up to his wife. I was done being the understanding grandmother who absorbed abuse in the hope of maintaining family harmony. It was time to focus on my own life. The first thing I did was put the house on the market. I'd originally bought it as an investment and a way to help my son, but now it was just a reminder of how badly I'd been used. Patricia handled the sale, and within 2 months, I had a buyer willing to pay $420,000, $35,000 more than I'd originally paid. With the proceeds from the sale, plus the money I'd saved by not having to support Richard and Jessica's lifestyle, I was in a much stronger financial position than I'd been in years. I paid off my apartment, bought a reliable new car, and booked a trip to Ireland that I'd been dreaming about since my husband died. But the most important change I made was in how I approached relationships. I started saying no. When my neighbor asked me to babysit her grandchildren while she went on vacation, I said no. When my church asked me to coordinate the annual charity drive, I said no. When my former colleagues asked me to cover shifts for nurses who called in sick, I said, over 45 years, I had been the person everyone could count on to sacrifice her own needs for others. I had been the reliable one, the giving one, the one who never said no. And it had led to me being taken for granted by the people who mattered most. I started investing my time and energy in relationships that were reciprocal. I joined a book club where intelligent women discussed literature and shared wine. I volunteered at a literacy program where my efforts were appreciated and acknowledged. I began dating again, something I hadn't done since my husband died, and met a lovely widower named Robert who treated me with the respect and consideration I'd forgotten I deserved. And slowly, I began to heal from the betrayal my son and daughter-in-law had inflicted. 6 months after they'd moved out of my house, Richard called me. It was the first time I'd heard from him since the Facebook post. "Mom," he said, and his voice was strained. "We need to talk." "Hello, Richard. How are you? How's Emma?" We're having some problems. Financial problems. The rent on our new place is really high, and Jessica hasn't been able to go back to work because childcare is so expensive." I felt a familiar tug of sympathy, followed immediately by a wave of anger. "I'm sorry to hear that." "Mom, I know things got complicated with the house situation, but I was wondering if you might consider helping us out again, just temporarily until Jessica can go back to work." "What kind of help are you talking about?" "Well, we're about 3 months behind on rent, and our landlord is threatening eviction. If we could borrow just enough to catch up, we could get back on track." "How much?" "About $6,000. $6,000. Less than what they'd cost me in repairs to my house, but still a significant amount of money." "Richard," I said carefully, "the last time I helped you financially, you lived in my house rent-free for over a year and then moved out without notice, leaving it damaged and full of your unwanted belongings. You never made a single payment toward the amount you owed me, and when I asked you to cover the repair costs, Jessica told me I was being unreasonable. Why would I consider lending you money again?" "Because I'm your son," he said, and I could hear the desperation in his voice. "Because Emma is your granddaughter." "Because family helps family." "Family helps family," I repeated. "Richard, when's the last time you helped me? When's the last time you asked how I was doing or offered to visit me, or included me in Emma's life?" That's different. You're financially stable. You don't need help the way we do." "I'm financially stable because I worked for 45 years and made careful decisions with my money. I'm emotionally stable because I've learned to surround myself with people who treat me with respect. Both of those things are choices, Richard." "Mom, please. We're desperate. If we get evicted, where will Emma live?" And there it was, the manipulation I'd finally learned to recognize. Using Emma as leverage, appealing to my love for my granddaughter to override my rational judgment. "Richard, where Emma lives is your and Jessica's responsibility. You're her parents. You made the decision to move out of my house where you were living rent-free. You made the decision to take on a rental payment you couldn't afford. You made the decision to exclude me from Emma's life while expecting me to continue supporting yours financially. That's not fair." "What's not fair," I interrupted, "is asking me to bail you out of problems you created while continuing to deny me a relationship with my granddaughter. What's not fair is Jessica lying to her family about owning my house while taking money from them for fake mortgage payments. What's not fair is treating me like an ATM instead of like Emma's grandmother." Richard was quiet for a long moment. "What do you want from us?" "I want honesty. I want respect. I want to be treated like Emma's grandmother instead of like a stranger who might babysit if you're desperate enough." "We can work on that," Richard said quickly. "Maybe we could set up regular visits, like once a month or something." "Once a month?" I felt the old anger rising. "Richard, Emma is 15 months old. I've seen her once in her entire life. Once a month isn't a relationship. It's an obligation you're trying to negotiate in exchange for money." "Then what do you want?" "I want you to figure out your financial problems without my help. I want you to learn that actions have consequences. I want you to understand that you can't treat people badly and then expect them to rescue you when things get difficult. So you're just going to let us get evicted? You're going to let Emma become homeless? I'm going to let you be adults who take responsibility for your choices. If you're truly facing homelessness, there are social services that can help you. There are family members on Jessica's side who might assist you, though they might be less willing now that they know the truth about your housing situation. Mom, please. Richard, I said, and my voice was steadier than I felt. I love you. I love Emma. But I won't continue enabling behavior that hurts me and teaches Emma that it's acceptable to treat people with disrespect. If you want a relationship with me, it needs to be based on mutual respect, not on my financial usefulness. And if we can't pay our rent, then you'll face the same consequences that any other family would face. You'll figure it out, just like millions of other parents do every day. I hung up feeling sad but also strangely liberated. For the first time in my life, I had put my own dignity ahead of my child's immediate wants. Richard didn't call back. 3 weeks later, Carol called me with an update. Rachel, I thought you should know that Richard and Jessica did get evicted from their rental house. They're staying with Jessica's sister temporarily. How is Emma handling the disruption? From what I can tell, she's fine. Children are resilient, but Jessica's not handling it well. She's been posting on social media about how family members have abandoned them in their time of need. Is she mentioning me specifically? Not by name, but she's making it clear that someone with the means to help them chose not to. She's getting a lot of sympathy from people who don't know the full story. And how do you feel about that? Carol was quiet for a moment. I feel like Jessica is learning that her actions have consequences. Her father and I offered to help with a security deposit for a new apartment, but only if she agreed to family counseling to address some of these patterns. She refused. What about Richard? Richard is caught in the middle, as usual. I think he's starting to understand that Jessica's version of events doesn't always match reality, but he's not ready to confront that fully. We talked for a few more minutes, and then Carol said something that surprised me. Rachel, Jessica's sister asked me to ask you something. She wants to know if you'd be willing to see Emma occasionally while they're staying at her house. She says Emma asks about the lady with the soft voice sometimes, and she thinks Emma might remember you from your visit. My heart clenched. Emma remembered me. After all these months, after only one real meeting, my granddaughter remembered me. Would Jessica allow that? I asked. Jessica doesn't have much choice right now. She's dependent on her sister's generosity, and her sister thinks Emma should know her grandmother. If you're interested, we could arrange something. I'm very interested. The next Saturday, I drove to Jessica's sister's house for what was officially a play date between Emma and Carol's other grandchildren. Unofficially, it was my chance to spend time with Emma without Jessica's interference. Emma was walking now, toddling around with the confident instability of a child who'd recently mastered upright locomotion. She had Richard's dark hair but my husband's blue eyes, and when she smiled I could see hints of the boy Richard had been. She was shy with me at first, clinging to Carol and watching me with curious caution, but when I sat on the floor and began reading to Carol's other grandchildren, Emma gradually moved closer. By the end of the afternoon, she was sitting in my lap while I read Goodnight Moon, her small hand resting trustingly on my arm. "Gamma," she said when I was getting ready to leave, and my heart nearly stopped. "She's been saying that for weeks," Carol explained. "We think she's trying to say grandma." She says it when she sees older women like she's looking for someone. I knelt down to Emma's level. "Yes, sweetheart, I'm Grandma Rachel." "Gamma Maggie," she said, and I felt tears burning my eyes. From that day forward, Carol and I arranged weekly visits. Sometimes they were at her house, sometimes at a park, sometimes at the library for story time. Jessica didn't attend these visits, but she didn't forbid them either. Richard never came. Over the following months, I watched Emma grow and change and develop into a little person with opinions and preferences and a vocabulary that expanded weekly. She learned to say my name clearly. She learned that I was the grandma who always had books in her purse and who made funny faces during peekaboo. She learned that I was someone she could count on, to show up when I said I would, and I learned that it was possible to have a meaningful relationship with my granddaughter even without my son's cooperation. The breakthrough with Richard came almost a year later, in a way I never expected. I was at the grocery store when I heard a familiar voice in the next aisle. "Emma, stay close to Daddy." "Don't touch anything." I rounded the corner and saw Richard pushing a shopping cart with Emma sitting in the child seat. He looked tired and stressed, and Emma looked fussy and bored. "Richard," I said, and he looked up with surprise. "Mom." "Hi." His voice was guarded but not hostile. "Gamma Maggie," Emma called out, reaching her arms towards me. Richard's expression shifted as he watched Emma's enthusiastic reaction to me. She knows you. We see each other regularly, I said, lifting Emma out of the cart when she continued reaching for me. Carol arranges visits so Emma can spend time with both her grandmothers. Richard looked confused. Jessica never mentioned that. Maybe Jessica doesn't know, I said gently. Or maybe she does know and has decided not to discuss it with you. Emma was chattering to me in her mix of real words and toddler babble, telling me about something that had clearly been very important to her. I listened with the focused attention that small children crave and adults often forget to give. She's really comfortable with you, Richard observed. We've spent a lot of time together over the past year. She's an amazing little girl, Richard. You and Jessica are doing a wonderful job raising her. Richard looked surprised by the compliment. Thanks. It's been harder than we expected. Most things about parenting are harder than expected, I said, but also more rewarding. Emma had settled contentedly in my arms and was playing with my necklace while continuing her toddler commentary on life. Richard watched us with an expression I couldn't quite read. Mom, he said finally, I owe you an apology. For what? For a lot of things. For taking advantage of your generosity. For letting Jessica exclude you from Emma's life. For not standing up for you when I should have. I felt a familiar tug of hope and immediately tried to temper it. What's changed? Richard ran a hand through his hair. Living with Jessica's sister opened my eyes to some things. I saw how Jessica's sister includes her kid's other grandmother in everything. Birthdays, holidays, just regular life. I saw how natural and easy it was, and I realized how much work Jessica had been putting into keeping you away from us. And how do you feel about that now? I feel like I let my wife convince me that my mother was the problem, when really the problem was that my wife couldn't share. He paused. And I feel like I missed a year of watching Emma get to know her grandmother because I was too afraid of conflict to stand up for what was right. Emma had grown heavy in my arms, the way children do when they're completely relaxed and trusting. What happens now? I asked. I'd like to start over, Richard said. Not with the house stuff. I understand that ship has sailed, but with us, with Emma, I'd like to try to rebuild some kind of relationship that doesn't depend on Jessica's approval. And Jessica? Richard's expression darkened slightly. Jessica and I are having some problems. She's been difficult to live with since we had to move in with her sister. It turns out that when Jessica doesn't have complete control over her environment, she doesn't handle it well. Are you considering separation? I'm considering a lot of things, Richard said carefully. But right now, I'm mostly focused on trying to be a better father and a better son. We talked for another few minutes while Emma dozed in my arms. When it was time to leave, Richard surprised me by asking if I'd like to meet them at the park the next day. Just the three of us, he said. I think Emma would like that. I handed Emma back to him, and she went willingly but sleepily. I'd like that too. The park visit went well. Richard and I talked while Emma played, and for the first time in over 2 years, the conversation felt natural and unforced. We talked about Emma's development, Richard's work, my volunteer activities, and my relationship with Robert. We didn't talk about Jessica or the house or the year of estrangement. When Emma fell and scraped her knee, she ran to me for comfort before she ran to Richard. I cleaned her wound and kissed it better while Richard watched with an expression of wonder. She really trusts you, Waisisi, he said. Trust has to be earned, I replied, applying a Band-Aid with cartoon characters. But children are usually willing to give adults a chance to earn it. And what about adult children? Richard asked quietly. I looked at my son, really looked at him, for the first time in months. He was 34 years old, but something about becoming a father had aged him. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before, and a weight to his expression that spoke of responsibilities and disappointments. Adult children get the same chance, I said, but the trust building has to go both ways. We began meeting regularly after that, not every week, but often enough that Emma began to expect Daddy and Gamma time as a regular part of her routine. Richard never brought Jessica to these visits, and I never asked about her. The divorce papers were filed 6 months later. I found out through Carol, who called me with a mixture of relief and concern. Jessica's been served, said she felt. Richard's filed for custody and division of assets. How is Emma handling it? As well as can be expected. Richard's been very careful to maintain her routine and keep the conflict away from her, and Jessica has been, Well, Jessica has been focused on trying to get as much money as possible rather than fighting for custody. She's not fighting for Emma? She's asking for full custody in the paperwork, but she's not actually fighting for it. Her lawyer seems to be focusing more on alimony and property division. I think Jessica sees Emma as leverage for financial support rather than as a person she wants to raise. The custody battle was ugly but brief. Jessica's deceptions about the house ownership came to light during discovery, as did evidence of her systematic exclusion of me from Emma's life. The judge was not impressed by a woman who had lied about owning property and had deliberately interfered with a grandparent's relationship with a child. Richard was awarded primary custody, with Jessica receiving alternate weekends and holiday visitation. No alimony was awarded, since Jessica had been living rent-free during most of the marriage and had contributed little to the household expenses. The day the divorce was finalized, Richard called me. "Mom, I have something to ask you." "What's that?" "Emma and I need a place to live. A real place. Not a temporary arrangement with the relatives. I've been looking at apartments, but everything I can afford is either too small or in neighborhoods I don't feel comfortable raising Emma in." I felt my stomach tighten. "What are you asking?" "I'm asking if you'd consider being our landlord." "Not for free this time. I want to pay real rent and have a real lease agreement, but I thought maybe we could rent your old apartment, the one you lived in before you bought the house I ruined." I was quiet for a moment, processing the request. "Richard, I sold that apartment last year. I'm living in a senior community now." "Oh, I didn't know." "But," I continued, "I've been thinking about buying another investment property, something smaller and more manageable than the house. If you're serious about a real rental arrangement, maybe we could look for something together." "You'd consider that? After everything that happened?" "I'd consider a business arrangement with proper contracts and expectations clearly defined, Takish," I said. "But Richard, it would have to be a real business arrangement. Market rate rent, security deposit, lease agreement, all of it." "I understand. And I want that. I want our relationship to be honest." 6 weeks later, Richard and Emma moved into a 3-bedroom townhouse that I'd purchased as a rental property. Richard signed a 1-year lease at fair market rent, provided first and last month's rent plus a security deposit, and agreed to maintain renter's insurance. But more importantly, he also signed a grandmother's rights agreement that Carol's lawyer had helped us draft. It guaranteed me specific visitation times with Emma and outlined my role in her life going forward. Emma adjusted to the new living arrangement with the resilience of childhood. She had her own room decorated with furniture and toys that Richard had bought himself rather than inherited from my generosity. She had a yard where she could play, and a grandmother who came for dinner every Sunday and babysat when Richard needed to work late. And slowly, carefully, Richard and I rebuilt our relationship on a foundation of mutual respect rather than financial dependence. The real test came 8 months later when Richard lost his job due to company downsizing. He called me the same day he got the news. "Mom, I need to let you know that I might be late with rent next month. I'm going to file for unemployment and start looking for a new job immediately, but there might be a gap in my income." "How long do you think you'll need to find something new?" "I'm hoping no more than a month or 2. I have some savings to cover most expenses, but the rent might be tight." "What's your plan?" "I'm going to apply for every relevant job I can find. I'm going to call everyone in my professional network. I'm going to look into temporary work to bridge the gap. And if I can't find anything within 60 days, I'll start looking for a less expensive place to live." I was quiet for a moment, marveling at the difference between this conversation and the one we'd had 2 years earlier. Richard wasn't asking me to solve his problem. He was informing me of a potential issue and outlining his plan to address it. "Richard," I said, "you've been an excellent tenant and you're a good father. If you need a 1-month extension on rent while you find new employment, I'm willing to work with you, but I'd want it documented in writing as a formal amendment to your lease." "Thank you," he said, and I could hear the relief in his voice. "I really appreciate that. And Mom, I know the difference between help and enabling now. If I can't find work within 60 days, I won't ask you to extend the agreement. Emma and I will figure something else out." He found a new job in 3 weeks. 2 years later, Emma is 4 years old and calls me Grandma Maggie. She spends every Sunday afternoon with me, and I keep her 1 evening a week when Richard has late meetings. She knows that Grandma Maggie's house has different rules than Daddy's house, but she also knows that both houses are places where she's loved and valued. Richard has evolved into a confident single father who makes his own decisions about Emma's care and doesn't need his mother's financial support to maintain his household. We have dinner together once a week, and he asks for my advice occasionally, but he doesn't expect me to solve his problems. Jessica sees Emma every other weekend, as mandated by the custody agreement. According to Richard, these visits are often chaotic and inconsistent, but Emma has learned to adapt. Jessica has never remarried, and from what I hear through Carol, she continues to struggle with accepting responsibility for her role in the divorce. I don't hate Jessica. I've come to understand that her behavior stemmed from deep insecurities and a need for control that probably predated her relationship with Richard. But I also don't pretend that we'll ever have a relationship, and I've stopped hoping that she'll change. The most important thing I've learned through all of this is that love without boundaries isn't actually love. It's enabling. For years, I thought that being a good mother and grandmother meant saying yes to everything, sacrificing my own needs, and absorbing bad behavior in the name of family harmony. But what I actually taught my son by doing that was that my feelings didn't matter, my resources were unlimited, and my love was conditional on my usefulness. I taught him that women, specifically mothers and grandmothers, existed to serve other people's needs without expecting reciprocal consideration. It took losing him for a year and nearly losing my relationship with Emma permanently for me to understand that boundaries aren't walls, they're guidelines for healthy relationships. Now at 71, I have a life that reflects my own values and priorities. I have a warm relationship with my son that's based on mutual respect. I have a close bond with my granddaughter that doesn't depend on anyone else's permission. I have financial security because I stopped allowing other people to drain my resources. And I have a romantic relationship with Robert that shows me every day what it feels like to be valued and cherished. The garage Jessica forced me to sleep in that cold night 3 years ago has become a symbol for me, not of humiliation, but of awakening. It was the moment I finally understood that I deserved better than the scraps of affection and respect that my family was offering me. Sometimes people ask me if I regret taking such a hard line with Richard and Jessica, especially since it meant missing so much of Emma's early life. The answer is no. I regret that it was necessary, but I don't regret doing it. Because the woman who would have slept in that garage and said nothing, who would have continued absorbing abuse and calling it love, who would have kept writing checks and pretending everything was fine, that woman was disappearing a little more each day. She was becoming smaller and quieter and more invisible until eventually she might have vanished altogether. The woman I am now, the woman who owns her own home and makes her own decisions and expects to be treated with dignity, that woman is someone Emma can look up to. That woman is someone Richard can respect. That woman is someone who models self-worth and boundaries and the kind of strength that comes from knowing your own value. I spent 45 years putting everyone else first, and it nearly cost me everything that mattered. Now I put myself first, and I've gained more than I ever thought possible. If you're reading this and you recognize yourself in my story, if you're the mother or grandmother who's always saying yes, always giving more, always accepting less than you deserve, please hear this. You matter. Your feelings matter. Your needs matter. Your dignity matters. And if the people in your life can't love you while respecting those truths, then they don't actually love you at all. They love what you do for them. There's a difference. And you deserve to know what real love feels like. Emma is learning that difference by watching how her father treats me now and how I allow myself to be treated. She's learning that grandmothers aren't servants or banks, but people with their own lives and feelings and boundaries. She's learning that love includes respect, that families can disagree and still care for each other, and that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is walk away from people who don't value you. These are lessons I wish I'd learned at 4 instead of 68, but better late than never. Last Sunday, as I was getting ready to leave after our weekly dinner, Emma hugged my legs and looked up at me with those blue eyes that remind me so much of her grandfather. "Grandma Maggie Weefoa," she said. "Will you always be my grandma?" "Always," I told her. "No matter what happens, no matter who comes and goes, I will always be your Grandma Maggie." "Good," she said with the satisfied confidence of a child who knows she's loved. "Because you're my favorite grandma." I am Emma's only surviving grandmother now. Jessica's mother, Carol, passed away last year from cancer. But Emma's declaration wasn't about being the only option. It was about being valued, chosen, and loved. That little girl sleeping in the garage that night couldn't have imagined that 3 years later she'd be someone's favorite grandma. She couldn't have imagined that standing up for herself would lead to deeper love, stronger relationships, and genuine respect from the people who mattered. But that's the thing about boundaries. When you enforce them consistently and kindly, you discover who really loves you, and you teach the people around you how love is supposed to look. The garage was where my old life ended, but it was also where my real life began.